All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating. We're going to explore this incredible centuries-old science that was designed for one purpose, to tell the difference between fact and fiction. We're talking about the methods that early Islamic scholars came up with to verify the hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad.
But let's just start with the big question right off the bat. How in the world can you be sure that a story, a quote, that's been passed down for over 1,400 years is actually true? I mean, that's a massive challenge for any historian. And for the early Muslim community, you've got to understand the stakes were incredibly high. So let's look at the threat they were up against and the amazing system they built to deal with it.
So yeah, for the early Muslim community, this wasn't some abstract thought experiment. As the Prophet's teachings were spreading, a really serious problem started to pop up: forgery.
You had people with all sorts of motives making stuff up and claiming the Prophet said it. Some did it for personal gain, others were caught up in deep sectarian rivalries, and a lot of it was just straight-up politics. And we're not talking about someone just misremembering something. This was the deliberate, intentional creation of fake reports to push an agenda.
And this quote really puts it into perspective, right? It tells you just how big the problem was. Of all the areas of Islamic knowledge, hadith was the one most targeted, the most vulnerable to being faked. The scholars of the time knew that if they didn't get a handle on it, the very foundation of the tradition could be at risk.
So what do you do when faced with a problem that big? Do you just throw your hands up? Nope. Instead, they got to work and developed something incredible. A powerful, really sophisticated new discipline. You could call it a science of certainty.
This whole field is called ulum al-hadith, which literally means the sciences of hadith. And the best way to think about it is as a kind of intellectual forensics. It was a formal system with strict rules and principles, all designed to pick apart every single report to figure out if it was legit, and in doing so, protect the Prophet's legacy from being distorted.
Now this brings us to a really interesting, kind of mind-bending idea about objectivity. See, in the modern West, we usually think of objectivity as something external, right? It's based on data, on evidence that anyone can go and check for themselves. But for these scholars, objectivity was an internal quality. It was rooted in a person's character, in virtues like being impartial, seeking justice. It wasn't enough to just look at the facts. You had to become the kind of person who could be trusted with the facts.
So what were these scholars actually looking at when they were doing their investigations? Well, to get how their method worked, we got to first break down the basic anatomy of a hadith. Every single report, no matter how short or long, has two main parts. First, you've got the sanad. That's the chain of narrators. It's the list of who heard it from whom, going all the way back to the Prophet. That's your chain of evidence. And second, you have the matan. That's the text itself, the actual quote or story that's being passed down. And here's the key. The scholars analyzed both parts with extreme care. They'd investigate the chain of people, the riwayah, making sure every single person in that chain was reliable, trustworthy, and had a good memory. But they also put the text itself, the diraya, under the microscope. Does it contradict the Quran? Does it contradict other more established reports? Does it even make sense? A hadith was only declared authentic if both the chain and the text passed this intense stress test.
This is where it gets really cool. To do all this investigating, they built this incredible toolkit, basically a whole collection of specialized mini-sciences, and each one was created to solve a very specific problem they kept running into. Okay, so picture this. You're a scholar, and you're looking at a chain of names. But in the old Arabic script, without the little vowel marks, tons of names look exactly the same. So names like Salam and Salam, written identically. How do you know which person is which? One little mix-up could discredit the entire report. So what do? They invented an entire field of study just for telling apart names that are written the same but said differently. I mean, just think about that level of detail. They built a whole discipline around it. It's pretty wild. But, okay, what if the names weren't just written the same? What if they were actually the same exact name? The sources tell us that at one point, there were 6 different narrators, all living at the same time, all named Khalil ibn Ahmed. 6 of them. Imagine trying to sort that out. You guessed it, they developed another specialized science just for this problem. Scholars would compile these huge biographical dictionaries tracking every detail. Who did this Khalil study with? Where did that Khalil live? Who were his students? They created a unique profile for each one, just to make sure there was zero confusion.
And the problems weren't just with the names in the chain. Sometimes the text itself had these blank spots. A report might say, a man came and asked the prophet, or a woman told him. Well, for a report to be considered solid, you really need to know who that man or woman was.
And so, of course, they created a science for that too. It was called the knowledge of the obscure. And scholars would dedicate themselves to this. They'd comb through other reports and historical records, trying to figure out the identity of these unnamed people. It's pure historical detective work.
So when you put all this together, you realize this wasn't just a flash in the pan. This wasn't the work of one person or one generation. This was a massive intellectual tradition, a legacy of scrutiny that was built layer by layer over hundreds of years.
And you can kind of see how it grew over time. You have early pioneers like El-Shafi laying the foundation. Then, a couple of centuries later, you get scholars like An-Nisaburi, who are already talking about more than 50 different branches of this science. And then a few centuries after that, guys like Ibn al-Salah come along and write these huge, comprehensive books that become the standard textbooks on the subject for generations.
So just how big did this whole field get? Well, by some counts, the sciences of Hadith eventually ballooned to encompass nearly 100 different sub-disciplines. 100! All dedicated to answering one fundamental question. Is this report authentic? Which kind of brings us back to today, doesn't it? I mean, we live in this age of so-called fake news and just a constant flood of misinformation online. It makes you wonder, what can this ancient, incredibly meticulous science of verification teach us right now in our own time? It's definitely something to think about.